Halo 2001. I just feel like a lot of things started there. Obviously, people have also made a point about, I mean, and it's been run into the ground. We don't have to linger on it. The Xbox One reveal and like what it was a complete miscalibration. I will never forget watching that. I was at IGN at the time watching that. And I told this story before that he's the VP of IGN now, but his name's Justin Davis. We were watching it on a TV and it was after the PS4 reveal, which I was at in New York City. And I was like, this thing fucking, like I said something like this thing's fucked or whatever. Like, and he said to me like, you're such a fucking fanboy or whatever. And I knew in my heart, I was like, this thing isn't right. Like there's something wrong with this thing. It costs more,
it's weaker, and they just talked about not games.
And so there's that. And then there's new leadership that comes in. But I think that leadership has been way too, and you could tell that they obviously strategized this behind the scenes, but they're way too reliant on blaming that moment and that generation for their downfall. No one had more access to money and capital. No one had more access to opportunity. No one could have made things happen in the ways that it's most difficult to make things happen, which is with money, than Microsoft. And where they are now is a far cry from where they could have been with their brand because they mismanaged it. It's mismanaged for totally different reasons than Sony. They had so much money and so much power in making things happen that I think that they lacked intent. And what I saw, the FTC leaks were catastrophic, I think, to their brand in the sense that I remember saying at the time, like, there was an email going around where it was like, here are all the companies we want to buy. And dude, you couldn't name a company that wasn't on that list.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's not strategy. There's no way Sony has a similar thing where it's like, here's the 7,000 companies we're going to buy. It's like, no, I bet you they have like a half dozen that they like look at and they're like, maybe we can make something happen with these guys and so on and so forth. They lost focus and they spent a ton of money. The money really didn't make any sense to spend. They vastly overpaid for Activision Blizzard. I think they got a pretty good deal on Bethesda, all told.
Sure.
But they're not able to manage it and they just don't have the right personnel. Matt Booty specifically is the executive where I'm like, I do not understand how you have a job. I don't understand how you had a job 5 years ago. I can't even fathom how you have a job now. You are a failure at your job. Like you cannot manage these studios. You do not know what you're doing. You don't know what you're doing. And so they had all the resources, but they didn't have the execution. I will also give them credit though, that they did try things that I think made some level of sense. And they didn't work out the way that they thought they would, but I'm not sure I would have made a different decision at that baseline. So an example is Game Pass. Game Pass is not working. I mean, I've been saying this for years and gotten a lot of grief on it. Everyone's always like, you were wrong about Helldivers. Okay, fair enough. How right was I about fucking Game Pass? How much did I call that from the very beginning? It's not only that it's not growing to where it needs to be, it's probably not even halfway to where they wanted it to be at this point.
No, I did a video analyzing the Xbox leaks and actually had a contributor to my channel read through literally every document and highlight things too. And like one thing that really stood out is, and I just remember putting out the video actually relative to my other ones bombed. But, you know, I was like, how is not everyone talking about the fact that they said it was something like Xbox needs to be at like 80 million by like, or Game Pass used to be at like 80 million subscribers by like, I don't remember what it was, like 23, 24 or something. Or maybe it was 50, but it was like something like 2028 it needs to be to 80, 100 million. And they're like halfway, and I did like a regression line to map where it should be and like where they would need to be aligned. And I'm like, they're like half of where they want to be to by now. And then there's an email where he says we need to kill Xbox if we don't get there. This should be like the only story in console we're talking about is that we have documents proving that they're half at where they need to be before they themselves said they'd have to kill it. I don't know how. I mean, people talked about it. I don't think it was talked about enough.
No, I again, because I'm fascinated by the incurious nature of like a lot of people in this industry. Like I just don't understand what they don't find fascinating. Like I would love to have this level of insight into Sony or especially Nintendo, to be frank.
Nintendo, yeah.
I mean, oh my God. I mean, having that level of insight into Sony would be one thing, but that level of insight into Nintendo would be fucking mind blowing. And amazing to know how they really operate. And they're such a closed book. But what I was saying about Game Pass, and I want to get it out there, and my audience knows this well, but your audience probably doesn't know my argument, is that I think Game Pass was a really good idea. If you look at it through the lens of the time, the position that Microsoft was in, the position that Sony was in and where things seem to be going, it's like, this is actually a pretty good idea. We have to upend the Apple.
Cancellation of game projects. I remember specifically Perfect Dark. I can't name all the other games that they've canceled. Uneven performance of their titles. They've made some very, very good games. I think that like Doom was really, really good. I expect that you're going to see really good games from them in the future. But what's going on there? I think they bit off more than they could chew with all these acquisitions all at once. And all at once meaning in about a 3-year period, they bought something like 8 or 9 different game publishers, but biggest being Bethesda and Activision. And I think Activision really was the straw that broke the camel's back. And why is it Activision immensely profitable? Why was that bad for them? Microsoft was in the midst of a pivot. They were going away from focus on console sales and trying to pivot to focusing on Game Pass sales. And I'm famously on record as saying I thought they'd have 200 million Game Pass customers in the next 10 years. They're making no progress toward that. Why is that? And it's because they're still doing game development the way everybody's always done game development. They're still running Game Pass the way it started, and they haven't evolved. So what's happened there is they made a bad decision to raise the price of Game Pass on the console to $20. It had been significantly cheaper. It's $10 on PC, but it had been in that $15 range, and they jacked it up to $20. They have not materially increased the amount of content, but what that did was it caused people to not buy an Xbox and sign up for Game Pass, play Call of Duty, get it for free, and quit. And so I think that what we've seen is increased churn on Game Pass. They're not supporting it enough, and I don't think that they've really thought through how to do it because they're doing the same thing they did when they formed it. They are continuing to make games as if they're going to sell into a giant console market, and they pivoted away from Xbox exclusive titles to now they're starting to put titles on PlayStation as well. But again, the PlayStation audience doesn't know most of these games. So, sure, there'll be an audience for Forza and Halo, maybe. Gears of War, yes. Perfect Dark would not have done well. So I think that Microsoft has to kind of rethink its strategy. I can come up with a whole bunch of ways that they can fix the company.
Phil agrees with this strategy, and he certainly openly says in some documents that he doesn't agree with their projections. He also, if anything, thinks that their projections aren't good enough, that Xbox actually needs to somehow get a ridiculous amount of Game Pass subs as soon as possible, one way or another. And to highlight how behind Xbox is in getting to where they think they need to be, well, let's bring up the fact that they openly said last year that they had hit 25 million Game Pass subs and that this just wasn't good enough. But then later, near the end of last year, Sony projected that maybe they had upped it a bit. They had gone from 25 million subs to 29 million Xbox Game Pass subs. Well, from the FTC leak this week, it is now official that actually, if anything, Sony is overestimating their competition, overestimating how many gamers actually want to use Game Pass. Apparently, it's quite possible that Xbox actually lost subs last year, and Phil Spencer is on record saying that at a minimum and at best, Game Pass subs were flat through last year. But what about Starfield? Could Phil Spencer possibly be banking on Starfield saving Game Pass subscriptions and catching back up to where he says they need to be, which is really almost double where they are now, for being honest? Well, recent data doesn't suggest that it has really saved anything. In fact, if you go and look at Steam Starfield data, the consensus out there is that the game has likely sold 2 to 4 million copies on Steam. And then, at least in Europe, we know that Starfield has outsold Resident Evil 4 Remake, which Capcom announced had sold about 3 million copies in its first 2 days. So, I don't know. We know that Starfield has at least probably 2 to 4 million real owners on Steam. We know that it's outsold Resident Evil 4 Remake, which means it sold it over 3 or 4 million, probably globally as well. And then we also know that it has been reported that 10 million people have tried Starfield. But think about what that means. That is 10 million people who have played Starfield, not purchased outside of Game Pass. So the top number of players is 10 million people. And then we know that 2 to 4 million come from Steam. And there's probably another, 4 million out there, maybe 2 million out there. And maybe some of that overlaps. But all of this points to not an exact percentage we can double down on, but a pretty firm suggestion that at best, a little over half of the Starfield players are people from Game Pass. And it's totally believable that perhaps less than a fourth of Starfield players bothered to do so through Game Pass, meaning it is incredibly unlikely that Starfield boosted Game Pass numbers more than a few million, and it may have not boosted them that much at all, especially when you consider, well, the 25 million people that already had Game Pass, those may have been all of those people that tried Starfield through it already. Maybe it wasn't that many new people. And with that out of the way, I think it's time
across hiring as well as sales. When it comes to gaming, we have 500 million monthly active users across platforms and devices. We are now the top publisher on both Xbox and PlayStation this quarter, with successful launches of Forza Horizon 5 and Oblivion Remastered. The Call of Duty franchise has never been stronger. 50 million people have played Black Ops 6. Total hours surpassed 2 billion. Minecraft saw record monthly active usage and revenue this quarter, thanks in large part to the success of the Minecraft movie. And we have nearly 40 games in development, so much more to come. We surpassed over 500 million hours of gameplay streamed via the cloud this year, and Game Pass annual revenue was nearly $5 billion for the first time. In closing, we are going through a generational tech shift with AI, and I have never been more confident in Microsoft's opportunity to drive long-term growth and define what the future looks like. With that, let me turn it over to Amy to walk through our financial results as well as the outlook.
All right, so based off of those clips that I showed you guys, we're going to be talking about Xbox today. We're going to be talking about the business of Xbox, some of the numbers and data points that they've been offering us these past couple months. They recently had an earnings report going over their business segments. And I wanted to touch on Xbox because it's very interesting what's happening here, right? As you guys know, they are going like full-on third-party, dropping their first-party titles on PlayStation now, and they've been able to have some success with it, with Forza Horizon being the biggest example. And while I think that it is a wise idea to do that to an extent, I don't know what the future of Xbox holds, because the writing's on the wall right now that Phil Spencer isn't going to be there much longer. Like he's pretty much gearing himself up for retirement. You have to look at some of the things that he's been saying, and a lot of the moves that they've been making behind the scenes. I'll talk about Phil in a different video and talk about his time at Xbox and give it a little bit more context to it. But as of right now, let's get into the data, right? Game Pass has reached over 35 million subscribers, right? Gaming revenue is up 10% year over year. But then when you look at the console sales for Xbox Series X and Series S, it's down 22% total year over year. So some people will argue that hardware doesn't matter. And that's a lie. One, it's a lie, it's a bad take, and it's a bad opinion. Hardware does matter. You need to be able to sell people on your core platform. Everybody's talking about Xbox Play Anywhere and being able to access Xbox in other places. But I'm going to provide some other data points that contradicts it and makes you think, okay, if let's say we agree with you, right? Then how come Xbox isn't making even more money for Microsoft, right? So let's get into it, because when you hear some of these takes from some of these people, and while like they're not bad people and they're not making arguments in bad faith, and they do make sound arguments at times, this is the one that you have to dismantle about hardware doesn't matter, because when Nintendo provides the data of how well they're doing with not only hardware but the amount of sales and services that they're able to attach in their hardware and providing you the data. And PlayStation can provide you a huge slideshow every single year as to why the business of PlayStation is growing at the rate that it is growing. Then you have to ask the question, how come Microsoft always provides vague stats, vague data, and they can't go in depth with how the business of Xbox is doing like a PlayStation and Nintendo can? That's an interesting question, right? So, like I said before, Xbox Game Pass worldwide has surpassed 34 million subscribers, right? That's despite their hardware sales being down. And like I said, if you want to be able to make more money off of your services and your games and other things like microtransactions, you need to sell consoles. When you sell a console, there's something, well, like any piece of hardware or anything else, there's something called attach rate. And I said this years ago, is that when you sell an Xbox, you want to be able to sell Game Pass along with that so that you can have a high attach rate for that. And that's going to increase revenue. Now, listen to what Satya Nadella said, the CEO and chairman of Microsoft. He said, when it comes to gaming, we have 500 million, keyword, 500 million monthly active users across platforms and devices, which is an insane number. Insane number. Now, if we do the math, right? Let's take him at face value and say, okay, even if we don't go into the specifics of out of that 500 monthly active users that you're claiming that you have across platforms and devices, how many of that 500 million is on Xbox? How many is on PC? Right? And we have to break that down. Every install of Windows 10 and Windows 11 comes with the Xbox app loaded on it, plus any other Windows device like a gaming handheld that you might pick up, right? That has a fresh install of Windows, has the Xbox app loaded on it. So are you counting that in that 500 million monthly active users, even though these people might not be using the Xbox app specifically and using other applications like Steam, EA app, Epic Game Stores, things like that, right? You have to really think about this, right? And this 500 million number, assuming it's true, right? Like let's play Satya Nadella's game. If you do the math on that, how come out of 500 monthly active users, do you only have 34 million Game Pass subscribers? Right? And look at the percentage difference. Like, the math is here. The math is here. Look at the percentage difference between 500 million and 34 million. The math isn't mathing, right? And another example of this is when he says 50 million people have played Black Ops 6, right? Now look at this. Look at the number of peak concurrent Call of Duty players on Steam, right? So you see that bar, and you look at the most recent data point, right? It's a little bit under like 100,000, right? So those 50 million people that quote unquote played Black Ops 6, right? And you only have what, 34 million Game Pass subscribers, and the game is free? What does that tell you about Game Pass? Not only that, what does that tell you about the Call of Duty IP right now? Because out of that 50 million people who quote unquote played the game, I bet you there wasn't a lot of people, not even like, I'll see more than half the people bought the game. The game is a weak title in the franchise, but that's a different discussion for a different day, right? So the 500 million active users across all platforms and devices needs to be put under greater scrutiny. That doesn't make sense. And where are you pulling this number from? Because You won't tell us how many units of Xbox Series X and S is sold, right? Not anymore. They're not giving us the numbers. It's ridiculous. And then when we do get a statistic like the Game Pass number of 34 million, how does that relate within context of the 500 million monthly active users? These are legitimate questions that need to be answered. Because your hardware is failing. You need to sell your hardware. And if you look at the Xbox gaming revenue generated by Microsoft, we know that the majority of the money that they make is from games and services, and you also want to make money off of Game Pass. But you can't attach Game Pass to hardware if you're not selling hardware. And everybody's trying to say that, hey, the money is going to be Game Pass and the revenue is going to be made up even if we're not selling hardware because of all these other devices. That's not true. That is not true. PC is a huge market. It is a huge market, and it's never been this big. PC gaming. And I don't understand how they haven't been able to tap into that market and double Game Pass subscribers through PC. And this is what I'm saying, where I'm like, some of these guys are not making sense with some of their arguments. You need to sell hardware. And then the market that does have the hardware, you're not even getting as many subscribers as you can potentially get. And on top of that, Xbox app isn't even a popular app on PC. So even if it's installed by default, which it is on Windows devices, people aren't using it, which means you have a weak brand. And when you point this out to people, they want to act clueless. I don't know what else to say. And then when you look at the Game Pass subscriber history count, right? It's not growing at the rate that you need it to grow. And there's all this data to support this. But people will act like you're crazy, right? Or at least I would say the Xbox supporters and the family. But who cares? When we're having a rational conversation and asking the right question as to what do you mean by you have 500 million monthly active users, but out of that 500 million, only 34 million is subscribed to Game Pass across your platforms and devices? Satya Nadella, you have to provide, more context into that 500 million, because that makes you look bad. Like, he said this thinking that this was a good point, but then how come you're not making more money in gaming revenue and services and getting more Game Pass subscribers? That's a legit question. So I want to get your thoughts on this. I want the community to engage with this. Get this video out there because we need these questions answered ASAP. And I don't know if I'm just hey, look, allegedly, theoretically, Xbox could potentially be a money laundering scheme. I don't have the proof. Listen, I don't have the proof, but if you ask me how they're spending money, all this money on all these studios, and the output hasn't been there, and then they lay off a bunch of people, and then these other projects are getting canceled, but you still have the same people up top. I don't know. Be on the lookout. This is Dope as J. Hit the like, subscribe.